Welcome back to the module on the internet, including privacy and security. As I mentioned in the preceding lesson, this lesson will discuss some aspects of internet privacy, including recommender systems and the right to be forgotten. In doing so, I'll also briefly discuss some underlying technical issues which are necessary to understand as part of those topics, including cookies, tracking pixels, and a little bit of high-level background about machine learning. As with all the topics in this class, this is really just a sampler, and it's meant to alert you to some of the key aspects you'll need to consider, be aware of, and think about in a career as a data scientist. First, as always, the new virtual background. Obviously, this is a church, and a very colorful church at that. It seemed to me that a church was an appropriate background for a discussion about privacy, as churches can provide both sanctuary and confidentiality, which can be very important parts of privacy. So the question is, where is it? You get to guess this one. If you can get the country, that's really good. If you can go beyond that, I'll be amazed, because it's not a particularly well-known or well-traveled space. What I'd like you to do next, unless you've done it already, is to listen to the TED Talk by Zeynep Tufekci, for which there'll be a prompt and a link in a moment. The talk is 23 minutes long, but my discussion of it will only rely on the first 10.5 minutes. So if you listen to the 10:30 mark, that'll be sufficient, although of course you're welcome to listen to the whole thing. Tufekci, by the way, is a sociologist who's a professor of information and library science at the University of North Carolina. What her talk is about, I'll just directly quote one of her first sentences, quote, "What we need to fear most is not what artificial intelligence will do to us on its own, but how the people in power will use artificial intelligence to control us and to manipulate us in novel, sometimes hidden, subtle, and unexpected ways." Pretty powerful. And it certainly would seem like controlling and manipulating people is an ethical issue. And more importantly, she talks about people in power. Well, that's you. In your careers as data scientists, you will have the power over some of the issues that she's talking about. So for all those reasons, this seems like something worth talking to you, or listening to rather. And after you do, we'll talk about what she says. And at the start of that, I'll fill in on a little bit of the technical background that one needs to have to understand what she's talking about. I hope you enjoyed listening to that video. I've listened to it many times. I always find it very interesting and very well done. Before we start talking about the content of it, I want to make sure that people have, at least at a superficial level, the technical background that's needed to understand some of the things that are being talked about. Many of you probably do already, so apologies for taking your time, but this will be fairly brief. Tufekci talks quite a bit about machine learning, and this course will refer to machine learning often. Of course, if you're taking this course as part of the data science degree, you'll take a whole specialization, 3 courses on machine learning. So now instead you get machine learning in a few seconds. So there are 3 main classes of approaches to machine learning, which are referred to as supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. And I won't even go into each of those, but simply say that what Tufekci is referring to in her references is almost certainly aspects of supervised learning. Supervised learning is the approach where you take in large volumes of training data and try to train a system to make conclusions from that data, which then can be replicated on other data of the same type that was not in the training set. An example of that, and a topic that we'll get to later in this course, is facial recognition, where you train a facial recognition system on data, faces, images that match people who are in a database that you have, although maybe not the same images as you have of those people. And the aim in the training is that they can align the data that comes in with the correct person that they already know about. And then the hope is that after that, they can get faces of people that were not in the training set and then align them properly with some large database of people and their faces that you have already. The next thing is perhaps getting a tiny bit more than we even need for this, but just to let you know that under supervised learning, there's lots of approaches, but there's really two main ones, what are called support vector machines, and then what is called artificial neural networks. And that's the thing that has become also known as deep learning. And these have slightly different attributes and strength. Support vector machines tend to be used more for classification, whereas deep learning, artificial neural networks can create more general sorts of conclusions from the data. I'm far from an expert. In fact, that was a bit of a stumbling explanation, so I think I'll leave it at that. But that's the realm of machine learning that Tufekci is talking about. The other thing that Tufekci talks about or refers to, in fact, I'll quote her, she said, "We don't really understand how they work." That's an absolutely correct statement, and it links to something that in recent years has become known as understandable AI. As an example, in artificial neural networks, where you have a whole stage of levels that you go through from getting from the input data to the output data, you would like to understand what's inside there and whether there's real knowledge that is embodied in those levels until you get to the conclusion. But we don't understand those things yet. And so in some sense, we've got an almost black box system. And perhaps one of the big scientific advantages of coming years and decades will be understanding the innards of those systems better than we do now. There's one more piece of technical background that I should mention briefly, and that's cookies. I'm referring here to the internet kind of cookies, not the chocolate chip kind of cookies. Tufekci doesn't explicitly mention cookies, but they're behind a fair bit of what she discusses. I think you're all familiar with this term because anybody who uses a web browser often sees these messages that says, we use cookies, will you accept their use? And then it kind of says unwritten, you have no choice anyhow. What are cookies? Cookies are basically a small piece of data that web browsers can store on your computer so that they can remember things that you did, purchases that you made, your browsing history, and they can use those stored pieces of data to then personalize their approach to dealing with you, their recommendations that they make to you. Interestingly, cookies are one of the places where the approaches differ in different parts of the world. Europe has a more restrictive approach to the use of cookies than the United States does. And this is a precursor of what we're going to learn about when we talk about the right to be forgotten. So I hope you enjoyed the Tufekci video. And now we're going to collectively address the question that she asked, that is, are we creating a dystopia? I'm going to bring back two of the examples that she used, the one about gambling and the one about YouTube videos. And we're going to analyze them through our ethical theories, meaning that for the first one, I'll actually do the analysis on this video. And for the second one, I'll set it up and then ask you to do the analysis through the use of a discussion group. So let's get immediately to the first one of those. What she puts forward is that AI does or can have the ability to diagnose when people are entering the manic phase of a bipolar condition. And then the second part, I think, is something that she just postulates could happen. I don't think she postulates it is happening, which is that that could be used by gambling vendors to try to lure those people into gambling at a time that they're particularly susceptible to being lured in that way. So the question then is, let's say that was happening. What do our ethical theories say about the ethics of doing that? Let's look at the three theories that we talked about in our ethical foundations. The first, Kantianism or deontology. I think it's pretty clear that taking a person who you know is entering a manic phase and luring them in to gamble is using them as a means to an end. You will likely make money off of their medical problems. So that seems clearly unethical under Kantianism. What about virtue ethics? That's a little harder because virtue ethics is a little fuzzier in its definition. The question is this what a virtuous person would do? I think all of us intuitively would say no to that question, and we could probably elaborate on that. Utilitarianism, as in many cases, is kind of interesting in this because that asks you not to look at the morals of it, but to in some way measure the gains and losses from doing that. And you could do that in various ways. Let's make this a little bit extreme. Let's say this person is not a wealthy person, but they go in and lose $10,000. So one way of looking at that is they lose $10,000, the gambling house gains $10,000, it's a wash. Another way you could look at that, and I'm not even sure that this follows the exact rules of a utilitarian analysis, but in the end there are to make, is that the value that that $10,000 has to a person who's not particularly well off, who may in fact be destitute after they lose that, is so much greater than the value that an extra $10,000 has to that, say, Las Vegas gambling house, that clearly the loss is greater than the gain. So as in many of these things, I'm thinking this through with you, not to show that there's a right or a wrong answer, but to kind of give examples of the thought processes that we might go through in evaluating the ethics and morals of a certain situation. I also want to note something important that perhaps points in a different direction. That entire, what we think is hypothetical example that Tufekci raised was based on the very realistic proposition that an AI system, a machine learning system, would be able to detect when a person was entering the manic phase of a bipolar situation. That in itself is not necessarily immoral or unethical. It could be exactly the opposite. It could be that that capability could lead to all sorts of good things. If, for instance, you notified people who live or work with that person, or you have ways of reaching out to that person. So this was not really a condemnation of the basic AI and the basic machine learning, but what we do with it. Now let's turn to a second example that Tufekci gave, which was the one of YouTube recommending songs that you might like based on the one that you're listening to now. I suspect that many of us are quite familiar with this. I certainly am. I enjoy listening to music to relax. And I actually enjoy the fact that YouTube will, based on what I'm listening to, provide other examples, very often artists or songs that I'm not familiar with. And I found this to be a really nice way to branch out. And I think I pretty much ignore the ads that come with them, so I may not have the negative consequence of it. But that may just be, or just is, one person's opinion. And the question is, if we look at our ethical frameworks, is this usage of recommender systems unethical, ethical, or kind of neither? We can't decide. So what I would like you to do now is, using the discussion board prompt that'll come up in a few moments, to take this example, pick one ethical framework, whichever one you want, and do a brief written analysis of what that ethical framework would say about these recommender systems that continue to try to lure you into using the service more, and in the process serving you more ads. You can actually do that in one of two contexts. One of them is the fairly benign one of listening to music, as we're talking about, but Tufekci also talked about a political context, which was driving people to more and more extreme content of whatever side of the issue they appear to be on already. And so please choose whichever one of those you would prefer, go through this discussion exercise, and then try to find at least one other student who has responded and read their response and comment on that. And then when you've done that, please come back to this lesson. I'd like to make one more comment based on the Tufekci talk before we move on. Uh, it was one of her kind of side comments early in the video where she referred to the George Orwell book 1984, and she said it was a great book, but not really relevant to what she was talking about. I kind of wonder about that. If you know 1984, kind of the key phrase from it is "Big Brother is watching you." So it talked about an authoritarian state where somehow there was the ability to watch all of its citizens at all times. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, has that perhaps come to pass, if perhaps not the way that George Orwell imagined it to come to pass? The instance that made me think about that first in a profound sort of way was a very sad one. That is the Boston Marathon bombing in the year 2013. One of the things that happened after that bombing is that in a very short period of time, if I remember correctly, it was more hours than days, the police had pieced together quite extensive and comprehensive video coverage of the scene. How had they done that? They had not done that precisely in the Orwell way that there was some main camera, but rather between the security cameras that many of the shops along that street had and the cell phone footage and videos that people who had been in the area had, they could piece together by combining all of those things a pretty good video of what had happened on the scene. And that led them to be able to diagnose the situation and eventually to the perpetrators. So has Orwell's vision come to pass? I should have a little quiz here. I'll just tell you instead about how many cameras there are in some cities in the world. China happens to lead in that category. Outside of China, the city in the world that has the most surveillance cameras is London. And the number is nearly 1 million. 700,000 is the estimate right now. Beijing, which is a far larger city, has over 1 million surveillance cameras. China as a nation is said to have about 200 million. And interestingly, and I have to admit I didn't know this until I looked it up, the place that is in our background for the first video of this module, Taiwan, or Taiyuan, sorry, is said on the internet to have the most surveillance cameras per capita of any city in the world, roughly 1 for every 9 people.